Before you can begin color managing your images in Photoshop, you need to understand how to work with the different color spaces. Those color spaces are RGB, CMYK, and lab color. Okay, now I'm currently working with the orangerose.jpg image, which I have open and visible on my screen, and you'll notice up here in the document tab that in parentheses it says RGB/8. And that stands for RGB color mode, red, green, blue, 8-bit image. Okay, red, green, and blue, those are the three color channels that make up this image. We can access the data in each of those channels in the Channels panel, which is by default grouped in here with the layers and paths. So let's click on that tab to bring it to the front. You can see here's the composite RGB, that's what we're viewing here in the document window. And then we have red, green, and blue. So when the information in each of these channels is brought together, that's how we get our composite image. Okay, now the RGB color space contains a rather wide gamut, and that's how we're able to get some of these really highly saturated colors, like in these leaves, okay, in these petals. Now you can't get those kind of saturated colors in some of the other color spaces like CMYK. CMYK contains a smaller color gamut. So that's where you have to think about how you're going to use your image ultimately when you're finished with your image editing. Are you going to output the image for display on a website or on a device? Is it going to be displayed on a monitor? Or is it going to be printed, or both? Okay, so when you're working with print images, images that are going to be sent to a commercial printing press, they ultimately have to be converted to CMYK color space. And that's where problems with your color can occur. Okay, because what you're seeing on screen here in RGB mode is not going to look this way when it prints in 4-color, CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, or black. Okay, let's take a look here. If I go into View, Proof Colors, I have my proof set up in such a way that I can view the image as it will appear when it's printed in CMYK color mode. So let's go ahead and choose that. And there we can see these colors in these petals is now much more muted. That's because of the smaller color gamut in CMYK. All right, so that's why most people will work in RGB mode all the way up until they're finished with their image editing, and then if they have to use the image for print, that's when they start using the soft proof method that I just showed you in order to decide whether or not they need to bump up the saturation of their colors before they convert to CMYK in order to print the image. Okay, now if you're just going to use the image to be displayed on screen, then it doesn't matter because it can stay RGB. Right? Things to consider, things to understand about these different color modes. There's also one other color mode. I'm going to press Command-Y or Control-Y to turn that proofing option off. There's one other color mode, and that's lab color. I'd like to talk about that just briefly. We'll go under Mode, and we'll actually convert this to lab color. And look at what happens in the channels. Over here in channels, we've got our lab composite, which is what we're viewing. But this is broken down into 3 different types of channels when comparing it to RGB. We have a lightness channel that contains all of the luminosity information for the image, okay, separate from the color information. So that's an interesting difference. Over here, we've got the A channel, which contains the color information for red and green colors. And then in the B channel, we have color information for blue and yellow. All right, so some people prefer to work in this lab mode because they have access to these channels, especially this lightness channel. For instance, some people like to sharpen the lightness channel in order to get a different type of sharpening effect. Some people like the quick access to red and green and blue and yellow in the A and B channels. So for instance, let's say we go back into layers in here, and then down at the bottom I'll click on the adjustment layer icon, and we can pull up curves, and we can access these channels just like we can when we're working in RGB. Okay, so we can go into, let's say, the A channel, which again controls red and green. And you'll notice that the image has a bit of a red cast to it. So if I want to correct this working in lab mode, I can click on my little handy pointer here, which allows me to click right in the image and adjust the colors. Let's say I click over here in this particular leaf, which should be more green. Click and then drag down. It's going to add more green in that area of the image. All right? And then if I want to bring more of the red back in this area, in these flowers, I can click and drag up and bring it back up to the baseline where I started in my curves, as you can see over here. Right, and that makes a huge difference. And it was very easy to make that correction in this channel in lab mode. It's a little bit trickier to do that when you're working with RGB in curves. So some people like to work in lab mode. Something else to consider about lab mode is that it has the widest color range of all 3. So that's another reason you might want to consider working in lab mode. The only problem with lab mode is that not every option in Photoshop is available to you here. So if I go back here into layers and we click on this adjustment layer icon again, you'll notice we don't have access to exposure or vibrance, black and white, channel mixer, or selective color. And some of these are pretty useful, especially I like selective color especially. Black and white is another one. If you wanted to convert this image into a black and white image, you wouldn't have that option, which is, unfortunate. So that's where the drawback is to working with lab color. And ultimately, if you're going to print the image, you're going to have to make the conversion to CMYK anyway. And again, we can soft proof Command Y, Control Y, and we can see where colors are going to get more muted. Okay, so you still have to consider that, okay, whether you're working in lab or RGB. If your ultimate goal is printing press, it's eventually going to have to be converted into CMYK. Okay, so now you have more of an understanding of these different color spaces in Photoshop and how you can work with them, which ones have wider or more limited color gamut ranges. And as we move forward, you'll know what to look for, okay, which space you should be working in, and where your ultimate goal is going to be, if it's going to be to display the image on screen, or if it's going to be on commercial printing press, and when to use RGB and when to use CMYK.